Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to be taking a look at a game that was played today in the FIDE World Junior Chess Championship under 20 being held in Mexico City. Now, to give you guys some background, the World Junior Chess Championship is a very prestigious event. In the past, the winner of the event would automatically become a Grandmaster. Now, in today's modern era, with so many young kids becoming Grandmasters younger and younger, all the top players in the event are already well north of 2,500 and have achieved the Grandmaster title. Now, the game we're going to be looking at today is a game between two American players, the #1 ranked seed Hans Niemann, who needs no introduction, Andy Woodward, also from the United States. Now, before we get into the game, I do want to take a second and actually mention something. Now, behind the scenes, occasionally I do help some junior players, whether supporting them via lessons or helping them travel to tournaments, and Andy Woodward is one of those players. Now, I do not actually seek out any sort of glorification, anything like that, but behind the scenes, I do try and help out some of these junior players from America. So let's jump right into the game. So Hans playing with the white pieces rated 2667, and Andy Woodward with the black pieces rated 2480. Now the game starts with knight f3. Andy plays knight to f6. We get c4, g6, knight c3, and bishop g7. Now, one fun fact is that even if I may not be helping Andy directly by giving him lessons or anything of the sort, he has asked me on some occasions what to do in various Grunwald variations. Now, as you guys may have also noticed in some of the speedruns, I have said that I think below Grandmaster level, trying to play the Grunwald is very, very difficult due to the fact that you yield the big white center, and white has a lot of different variations which he can play. So in this game, Hans is clearly trying to avoid the Grunwald by playing knight c3. If black does play d5 here after takes, there are many lines that white has. Probably the main line is queen a4, and after knight to c6, I believe here white can play this move e3 with bishop b5 or knight e5. I think even knight d4 is a move here, at least according to the old mainline theory. Now again, times change, so what I'm referring to is back to when I was playing the Grunwald as a junior many moons ago. At any rate, Andy plays bishop g7. We get e4, and he plays this move e5. Now, I don't know when the first game with this move was played, but I do remember the first top level game that I saw which featured this variation, and it was all the way back in 2019, which I guess is not really that long ago, but it feels like an eternity ago, at the FIDE Grand Prix held in Moscow. And it was played by the very enterprising Russian player Daniil Dubov against Anish Giri. So after e5, the game continues with knight e5. We get castles, and black has temporarily sacrificed a pawn, but he has moves like rook e8 and d5 to get a lot of play very quickly. So the game continues with knight f3. We get rook e8, d3 here. White's trying to guard the pawn on e4, and now we get this nice move d5, ripping open the center. Now you can activate the bishop on the light square diagonal. You're opening up the dark square diagonal as well, and it's very interesting for both sides. So we get c takes d5, knight takes d5, and here Hans plays bishop to d2. We get bishop to g4, and now this move bishop e2 is played. Now in the aforementioned game which I refer to between Anish Giri and Daniil Dubov from the FIDE Grand Prix in Moscow 2019, that game actually continued with queen b3, and after knight c3, bc3, Dubov played knight a6, trying to jump to the center with the knight very quickly. We had bishop e2, knight to c5, queen to c2, and after bishop takes knight, white was unable to capture the bishop because then you would hang the pawn on d3. So Anish played g takes f3, and after queen to h4, Daniil achieved equality very easily, and Anish actually forced a draw very soon in that game. Now I remember very clearly in that game that Anish was way down on the clock. He was really just like blown away out of the gates, and Dubov would actually beat Anish in that match. So back to the game, we get bishop to e2 from Hans. Now Hans is basically trying to argue he's going to finish the development by castling the king out of the center of the board here, and if he gets the king castled here, let's say black goes knight b6 and castles, white probably has a bit of an advantage because even though these pawns are a little bit weak, they are pretty well defended here. The bishop guards the pawn on d3, and the knight guards the pawn on e4. So Andy plays knight to b4, attacking the pawn on d3. Hans plays bishop to e3, so now the bishop and the queen both guard the pawn. Andy takes the knight. Hans captures with the pawn, of course, because after bishop takes bishop, you would lose the pawn on d3, and after king e2, knight takes b2. Black is not necessarily winning, but after the queen trade, black simply has an extra pawn here on the board and great chances to win. So Hans takes with the pawn, and he plays knight 8 to c6, and we get this move h4. Now h4 is an interesting move. This is actually a very similar structure to what we call the Shevchnikov Sicilian. I guess I'll set it up just so you guys understand the pawn structure. So in the Shevchnikov Sicilian, one of the main setups that you can get is something like knight c3, e5, knight b5, d6, something like bishop g5, a6, takes, and knight to a3. And black can play bishop e6, black can play f5, but you have this classic pawn formation with the bishop inside sort of this nest. Now again, it's a little bit different because here white is not down any material, but the structure is the exact same. So back to the game, you'll notice again pawns on f2, f3, e4, d3, this little triangle with the two bishops here, but white has an extra pawn, so black has to be very active. So we get knight 8 c6. Hans plays h4. Now I do feel like a3 is a move that makes a little bit more sense, and after knight to a6, maybe you can play h4 here, maybe you can go rook c1, but it just seems a little bit weird in this position to not force the knight to the edge of the board where it will have to jump back towards the center, because in the game after h4 knight d4, the knight always has a home on c6 and it overprotects the knight on d4 potentially, but it can also jump to e5, whereas if, just to illustrate the point, the knight's on a6, it's headed only towards the c5 square. So knight on the rim is a little bit dim. So h4 is definitely an interesting decision from Hans. Now I suspect this was still probably theory, so both players are following the top computer lines. So we get knight d4, rook c1 is played here by Hans, and he plays queen to d6 here, a logical move. Black wants to bring the other rook to the center and really mask the forces and put pressure on the pawns on d3 and f3 with these knights. So Hans plays a3, we get knight to a6 played here, and now we have f4 being played by Hans. Now at this point, computer's feeling really good about things for white, but there are some general drawbacks from a practical standpoint. First of all, white has trouble castling the king. If you castle to the king side, let's just say black were to play rook a d8 like in the game. If you castle to the king side here, black can play like queen e7, h5, and queen h4, and your king is very weak here on g1 potentially. Additionally, here after h4, white could trade the knight for the bishop, and after queen e2, queen d3, black has evened out the material and should have no issues either. So the biggest issue in this position for white is that even though white has an extra pawn, the king is kind of stuck in the center. Black has this great outpost on d4 for the knight, and it's not so easy in terms of coming up with a plan. Now I suspect this is also why Daniil Dubov, the Russian grandmaster who played the system in 2019, decided to do against Anish Giri for the exact same reason. Even if the computer likes white's position, black has a lot of easy moves. You want to bring the knights back to the center, maybe go c5, knight c7, knight e6. Either way, black's moves are a clear reaction to whatever plan white comes up with. So here we get b4 being played by Hans, and now the move c5 played by Andy, trying to reinforce the knight on d4, and if white trades the pawns on c5, then the knight is jumping, and immediately there's all kinds of pressure in the center of the board. So after c5, Hans plays e5, and now we get the move queen to e7, retreating the queen here, and now black has many ideas. First of all, you'd love the trade to hit the pawn on d3, but you also have ideas like, let's just say white goes rook b1, where you can play f6, and after bishop takes f6, suddenly there's a lot of pressure on both the e and the d files. So here we get b5, knight c7 is played by Andy, we get queen to a4, overprotecting the pawn on b5, and now Andy plays this move queen to e6. Now already here the computer thinks the advantage is completely gone, and I think the reason is quite clear. By pushing the pawn to e5, even though you open up a square for the knight on e4, black can go knight f5 or knight d5, and there's f6 to open up the center of the board, and it's already a very precarious situation. So here Hans plays bishop to d1, retreating the bishop. I suspect the reason he played this move is simply because he didn't want to allow the bishop to be traded. Let's say white were to play, I don't know, a move like h5, maybe you can trade and go g5 to undermine the pawn structure potentially. I guess after fg5, queen e5, and h6, white is okay, but it looks really scary. It's like playing a bomb cloud with the king in the center of the board. You have a weakness on d3. The rooks and the queen are ideally placed for black on the two open files, so it's very hard to play this. So Hans goes bishop d1 here, and as I said, it's just to avoid the trade of the knight for the bishop. And now Andy plays the move queen f5, and already here the computer thinks that Hans is in a world of trouble here. Probably if it was two computers playing the game, black would already win this every single time. Now it's very difficult for white because since Hans has moved the bishop to d1, now the pawn on d3 is under attack. f6 is a very big threat. There's also moves like knight e6 putting pressure on the pawns on e5 and f4, even bishop h6 as well, and it's very difficult to play. So here Hans plays queen c4, guarding the pawn on d3 while attacking the pawn on c5. And now Andy finds bishop h6, which is an excellent move because white is really struggling to guard the pawn on f4, and if you lose the pawn on f4, you will lose the pawn on e5, and with it the whole house is very likely going to collapse. So Hans plays knight to e4, and now Andy plays bishop takes f4, sacking the rook. And after knight f6, king g7, we get knight takes rook, rook takes e8, and now black is doing great simply because of the blockade on the dark squares. The e5 pawn is falling. The king on e1 is very open here. You can't really castle it or get the king to safety, and it's looking very, very bad. So Hans plays queen takes pawn on c5. Andy plays knight takes b5. Another nice move here, protecting the knight on d4 from the side, all the while keeping the rook ready to capture his pawn on e5 and create a double attack. So here Hans castles, we get rook takes e5, and another excellent move here from Andy. Castles really is the only move I think that can be played here. If you don't castle, I think you're in a lot of trouble. So you get rook e5, bishop takes d4. On first glance, it looks like there's a pin, so you can't capture the queen. However, you can play knight takes bishop, queen takes knight, and now you take the rook. Now here the dust is settled. Hans has gotten his king out of the center of the board. At the same time, however, he is down a pawn. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, obviously, this event's being held in Mexico City, so I might as well count in Espanol. So, in this position, on first glance, you might think, well, wait, white goes f4. You pin the rook. GG, why not? The rook on e5 is going to hang. There's no queen g4 because that would be a Botez's gambit. But if you play f4, black can move this bishop to e3, checking the king and attacking the queen at the same time. If you move your king, I take your queen. If you take the bishop, I take your queen, and either way you will lose in a couple of moves. So Hans plays rook to e1 instead. Also, I have to mention that if white were to play bishop g4, which looks like a fossil because the queen guards the bishop, you attack the queen and the bishop at the same time. Black can simply play the very quiet move queen to f6 here, and after you take the bishop, I have rook to e1 check, creating the fossil. Rook takes rook, queen takes queen, and black will win because the queen is much stronger than the rook or the bishop. So Hans plays rook e1, Andy goes bishop to f4, retreating the bishop and guarding the rook on e5, and here Hans plays the move rook to e4. Now again, it looks very, very scary on first glance because after rook to e4, suddenly your bishop is under attack. You can't just move it without losing the rook, and if you move it here, I take h2, same problem, you just lose the bishop. So you can't really move the bishop without losing the rook here, and it doesn't really seem possible to save the bishop. However, there's a very nice move here, which is queen to f6. Now, maybe Hans missed this move. Hard to tell whether he missed it or not, but queen f6 is a move that actually saves all the material here. The reason for that is if white plays rook takes bishop here, you have rook to e1, creating the kebab by checking the king and the bishop, as well as the fossil at the same time. And after king g2, you trade the queens, take the bishop, and black is much better. Now, is this actually a winning rook and pawn endgame? I'm not actually completely sure whether this is winning. The computer gives rook d7 and then a move like a5, and black probably has winning chances. Is actually winning very, very murky. After rook b7, rook d3, however, you would win this a pawn or the h pawn and win the game. And if white were to play a4 here, after rook to a1, not rook takes b7, sorry, rook to d4, for example, rook b1, black probably should be winning, but again, maybe there's some practical complications. At any rate, Hans plays h5 instead here, trying to get rid of the weakness and push his pawn up the board. And here Andy finds the best move, which is rook to g5 check. And the reason this is the best move is that you really don't want to have to trade the rooks here, because after the rook trade in this position, even though black has an extra pawn here with 5 versus 4, it is an opposite color bishop ending, and it's odd because the computer actually thinks this is winning. I'm not sure if it is, but you never really know for sure if it's winning, and generally opposite color bishop endings have a lot of drawish tendencies, so if you can avoid them, you definitely want to. So we get rook g5 check, king to f1, and here Andy plays bishop to e5. No queen trade here, keeps the queens, the rooks, and the bishops on the board. Now, another very important theme to keep in mind is that when you're playing positions with opposite colored bishops, the general theory goes if one side is attacking, if one side is like a weak king or something like that, if they're opposite colored bishops, the attacks become much more venomous because you simply cannot ever really obstruct the opposing bishop. I don't know if that's the right word, but I think you guys get the point. So generally, if you're attacking as opposite colored bishops, it's a really, really good sign and you're gonna have a great chance to win. So after bishop e5 is played here, Hans plays queen takes at a7, which is a very serious mistake. The computer thinks that queen e3 is the only move here, and after black grabs the second pawn, it looks like on first glance f4 is forking the rook and the bishop, but black can very quietly retreat the bishop away and the pin on the king still exists. Nonetheless, in this position after rook to h4, it's still quite tricky in terms of black trying to win the game. Computer wants queen g6 to guard the pawn on h5, but after bishop f3, very, very difficult to win. That being said, in a human game versus computer game, it's obviously going to be a lot easier for black to play because the white king is always very, very weak here, whereas your king on g7 is actually very, very safe on the diagonal, no rook g4 ideas, and it's just impossible to play. So Hans instead plays queen takes a7 here, and I think Hans missed the next move, which Andy found, which is this move b6. Now this is an excellent move because what it does is it breaks the coordination here. Queen guards the pawn, and the idea is quite simply you want to go bishop d4 and go after the f2 pawn, or play rook f5 as well. And now the queen on a7 is also way off sides. Like if you could magically put this queen, I don't know, like somehow you could get this queen back to like e3 for example, white has some chances to save the game. But after b6 is played, the queen is simply cut off and it's just not in the game at all, and the computer thinks at this point that it's completely lost. So Hans plays queen to a8, and here Andy decides to take the pawn on h5. Now there are two moves that are winning here. G takes h5 is the more human approach. h6 however is also a winning move, so after white takes on g6, you can go bishop to d4, threatening mate, and after say f4, there's rook g1, king e2, rook g2, king f1, check, king e1, and then queen h4, and there are all sorts of bad things happening here. The white king will be checkmated very shortly. The one thing you do not want to do, however, is play a move like bishop to d4 for example, because then white can sack the pawn with h6 check, king takes pawn, and after queen to f8 check, queen g7, there's this very nasty move rook to h4 check. You have to block with the rook. I swap the queens, take the rook, go rook b4, win this pawn on b6, and then push p up the board and win the game. Unfortunately for Hans in this situation, it's not very difficult for Andy because there really are only two moves. Either you play h6 or you take, because h6 and queen f8 is really the only threat. So we get g takes h5, Hans plays rook to e3, and now Andy finds bishop h2, another excellent move here, trying to infiltrate with the rook going down to g1, and at this point it's simply a disaster for white. So here Hans plays rook to e8, a last-ditch effort to try and checkmate on the back rank here, but it is simply too slow. Now here, if you were a computer, you'd play rook to g1 check, king e2, queen b2 check, king to f3, and then the very cold-blooded move king to h6 with ideas like rook takes bishop, rook g6, queen f6, etc., and it's winning. Now you could not take the bishop here on d1 because after rook to g8, king h6, queen f8 would lead to a checkmate. And if you go king to f6 here, white is actually mating after queen c6, king e7 gets mated by rook e8, and if you go king e5, I think rook g5, king d4, rook d5 would be mate, and if you go king f5, the one last move to try and keep the game going, there is queen to e4, king to f6, queen to h4 check, king e6, and rook e8, and sooner or later the black king is going to get checkmated here. So this would be the computer way to win, because if white were to play queen c6, you can block with the rook, then you have rook f6, and you have all kinds of right triangles, and it's simply GG. Now the reason that this is actually best is because in this exact position the queen covers a c1 square. So when we get back to the game and king h6 is played, Hans has one last move for sort of the miracle prayer, which is this move d4. Now in a human game I don't really expect this move to be played because it simply looks like a free pawn, but if black were to take after queen c6, if you play rook g6 here, now white can go queen to e4, and there are ideas like queen e3 incoming here. If you go check, there's bishop c2, and suddenly it's not so clear how to proceed, because queen e3 is a big threat. Your rook on g6, a little bit clumsy here, and there are some serious chances for white to maybe pull off a swindle. Again, in a human game, very, very difficult to play d4 considering the times that both players have here as well. Just probably too much to expect. So Hans plays bishop c2 instead, and this is actually the single worst position you can play here, or single worst move you can play in the position here, and the reason is actually quite simple. It forces black to find the obvious winning move. Now what I mean by that is that, for example, say Hans were to play a move like even queen to not queen e4, actually queen e4 is a reasonable idea. If you were to play queen e4 here, it's not so obvious what the winning move is. If you go check, king f3 and takes, white actually has queen e3, king g8, and king g6 and rook g8 to win the game. Additionally, you could move the bishop to f4, you can move the bishop to d6, you could also move the rook back, but it's very, very unclear what the winning move is. But when Hans plays bishop c2 here, he essentially forces his young American opponent to find the absolute best move, because there really are no ideas here. Sure, you could move the bishop back to f4, e5, but it doesn't really do anything. You don't have rook g2 because the queen covers a square. Rook c1 maybe is a move, but after say rook c8 threatening rook c6, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So you don't really have rook moves, you don't really have bishop moves, and then you of course notice there's this move queen to c3 here, which is a very straightforward move because white simply has no checks in this position. The queen covers the c6 square, the pawn at f7 covers the e6 square, and you're threatening rook e1 and queen e1 as well. So after queen to c3, Hans plays rook to c8, and now we get rook to e1 check, king to f3, queen to f6, checking the king on f3. We get king to g2, and after the move rook to g1 is played, Hans Niemann resigns this game against his young 2480 American IM opponent. That was all a little bit of a mouthful there, but anyway, we keep going. So after rook g1, Hans resigns the game because mate is inevitable. If you play king takes h2, there's queen takes f2 check, king h3, and queen g3 would be checkmate. If you play queen g2, queen takes queen is obviously checkmate as well. And if you go king to h3, the only legal move in the position, I very quietly play queen f5 check. With king h4, it's mate in one with queen g4, and after takes, we reach this exact same position where if you block with the queen, it's mate. If you go up, it's queen g3 checkmate as well. So after rook g1, Hans resigns this game. Andy Woodward moves to 3 out of 3 in the event. Hans loses, and he is now on 2 out of 3. All in all, a very exciting game, a masterful performance from Andy Woodward, I would say. He played this game extremely well, found a lot of very, very good moves, and Hans simply was not up to the task in terms of defending. So great win for Andy. He moves to 3 out of 3. Hans on 2 out of 3, but it is a long event. Many more rounds to come. At any rate, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. Make sure to smash that like button on YouTube, or the subscribe button on YouTube. A little bit out of it, you guys. I actually did a little bit of a meme there with the smash, but make sure that you do smash that subscribe button here on my YouTube channel, and we'll be back soon with some more great YouTube only content. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your evening, morning, or afternoon, wherever you are in the big wide world. Bye.